The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath the morning sun as the cruise ship Monarch of the Seas glided toward its final port. For most passengers, this 7-day journey along Mexico's western coast had been a dream vacation. For 34-year-old Valentina Restrepo, it would become her tomb. Valentina had booked this cruise with her family to celebrate her mother, Clara's 60th birthday. Originally from Medellin, Colombia, the Restrepo family had immigrated to Los Angeles 15 years earlier, building a modest but comfortable life in the sprawling Colombian community of Pico Rivera. Valentina worked as a bilingual elementary school teacher, beloved by her students and respected by colleagues. Her warm smile and infectious energy made her the life of every gathering. The family dynamics aboard the ship were complicated. Clara had remarried 3 years ago to Roberto Salazar, a 62-year-old retired construction foreman originally from Guadalajara. The marriage had strained relationships within the family. Valentina's younger brother, Diego, openly distrusted Roberto, while her sister Camila tried to keep peace. Valentina herself maintained polite distance, never quite warming to the man who'd replaced her late father. Roberto was an imposing figure, tall, heavy-set, with calloused hands and a commanding presence that some found comforting and others found intimidating. He spoke little English despite 2 decades in the United States, preferring to communicate in his native Spanish. Clara seemed happy enough, though family members noticed she'd become quieter, more deferential since the wedding. The cruise had departed from San Diego on March 15th, making stops in Ensenada, Mazatlan, Puerto Vallarta, and Cabo San Lucas before the scheduled return. The ship carried over 3,000 passengers, a floating city of tourists seeking sun, margaritas, and mariachi bands. Accommodations had been arranged across 3 cabins. Clara and Roberto shared one stateroom. Diego and his wife occupied another with their 2 young children. The third room housed Valentina, Camila, and Camila's teenage daughter, Sofia. This arrangement seemed logical, separating couples and keeping the younger generation together. Until March 20th, the voyage proceeded without incident. Passengers enjoyed poolside lounging, buffet meals, and evening entertainment. The family gathered each night for dinner, though tensions simmered beneath polite conversation. Roberto drank heavily at meals, his voice growing louder and his comments more pointed as the tequila flowed. More than once, Valentina had intervened when Roberto's jokes crossed into inappropriate territory, earning icy stares from her stepfather. On the 19th, the ship docked in Cabo San Lucas. Most of the family went ashore for a snorkeling excursion. Valentina stayed behind, complaining of a headache. She was last seen by cabin stewards around 2 in the afternoon, reading by the pool. By evening, when the family returned, Valentina was nowhere to be found. Initial searches seemed routine. Perhaps she'd met someone, gotten caught up exploring the ship's many bars and lounges. But as hours passed and Valentina failed to answer her phone, alarm grew. Diego demanded the crew search every deck, every corridor. Ship security initiated protocols, checking surveillance footage and interviewing staff. Clara grew hysterical. Roberto remained oddly calm, suggesting Valentina had probably gotten drunk and passed out somewhere. This comment infuriated Diego, who knew his sister rarely drank more than a single glass of wine. The argument between stepfather and stepson escalated until security had to separate them. By midnight, ship officials contacted Mexican authorities and the FBI. A missing passenger triggered serious protocols. The captain delayed departure, keeping the vessel docked while searches continued. Crew members checked every public space, every storage area, even the engine rooms. Passengers were questioned. Valentina's photos circulated through WhatsApp groups and social media. Morning brought no answers. As sunrise painted the Cabo coastline gold and pink, Valentina Restrepo remained missing. Her phone was found in her cabin, charging beside her bed. Her purse, passport, and money were untouched. She'd simply vanished. What nobody knew yet was that Valentina hadn't vanished at all. She was still aboard the ship, hidden in plain sight, concealed beneath a heavy storage trunk in the room she shared with her sister and niece. And the person responsible was closer than anyone suspected. The discovery came on March 21st at 9:15 in the morning. Maria Gonzalez, a cabin attendant originally from Veracruz, entered stateroom 8247 for routine cleaning. The three women assigned to this cabin had spent the night with Clara and Roberto, too distraught to sleep in the room where Valentina's belongings sat untouched. Maria noticed the smell first. In her 12 years working cruise ships, she'd encountered every odor imaginable. From spoiled room service to backed-up toilets, this was different, metallic, organic, wrong. The cabin appeared orderly. Beds made, though clearly slept in the previous night. Luggage organized, but the large decorative storage trunk positioned against the wall caught her attention. The ship provided these trunks in premium cabins for passenger convenience. This one seemed oddly positioned, pushed tight against the wall in a corner that blocked natural foot traffic. Maria approached, noting dark staining along the trunk's bottom edge. Her heart accelerated. She'd heard about the missing passenger, seen the woman's photograph on crew bulletins. Every staff member had been searching. She lifted the trunk's heavy lid. The scream that followed brought security running from 3 corridors away. Within minutes, the cabin was sealed. The captain himself arrived, face ashen, and immediately contacted authorities ashore. The FBI liaison already aboard due to the missing person case took control of the scene. Valentina Restrepo lay curled inside the trunk, her body positioned in a way that suggested she'd been forced into the confined space. She wore the same yellow sundress witnesses had seen her in 2 days earlier. Visible bruising marked her neck. Her eyes were open, fixed in a final expression of terror and surprise. The ship's medical officer, Dr. Kenneth Palmer, arrived to pronounce death officially. He estimated she'd been deceased approximately 36 to 48 hours. Preliminary examination suggested asphyxiation, though a full autopsy would be required. There were defensive wounds on her hands, signs of a struggle. Breaking this news to the family fell to FBI Special Agent Marcus Webb, a veteran investigator specializing in maritime crimes. He'd been aboard since the previous evening, coordinating the search. Now that search had become a homicide investigation. Clara collapsed when told. Her wails echoed through the corridor outside the security office. Diego had to be physically restrained, rage and grief overwhelming him. He kept screaming one phrase repeatedly. "I told you something was wrong. I told you." Roberto's reaction was notably different. He sat motionless, hands folded in his lap, staring at nothing. When Agent Webb asked if he understood what had been said, Roberto simply nodded once. No tears, no outburst, just stone-faced silence. "When did you last see your stepdaughter?" Webb asked. Roberto's response came slowly, carefully. "At breakfast, March 19th. She said she had headache, stayed on ship. And you didn't see her again after that morning?" "No. I went to Cabo with Clara. We returned late, Valentina not in cabin." Webb noted the man's remarkable composure. Most family members reacted with visceral emotion to news of a loved one's murder. Roberto showed less feeling than he might for a weather report. Camilla provided more detailed information through her tears. She'd last seen Valentina around 1:30, just before leaving for the shore excursion. Valentina had been lying on her bed, reading a novel, saying she'd rest and maybe swim later. Nothing seemed wrong. No arguments, no concerns, but Sophia, Camilla's 15-year-old daughter, remembered something else. The night before Valentina disappeared, Sophia had returned to the cabin around 11 to retrieve her phone charger. She'd heard raised voices from the hallway outside. Peering out, she'd seen Roberto and Valentina speaking tensely near the elevators. Roberto had his hand on Valentina's arm. Valentina had pulled away sharply, her face flushed with anger or fear. Sophia couldn't tell which. What were they saying? Agent Webb asked. Sophia shook her head. They were speaking Spanish, fast, quiet, but Tia Valentina looked scared. This information changed everything. Webb immediately separated Roberto from the rest of the family, placing him in a secure room for questioning. Mexican federal police boarded the ship in Cabo, along with additional FBI personnel. The vessel was now officially a crime scene. Passengers were confined to their cabins while investigators worked. Social media exploded with speculation. Videos appeared on TikTok and Instagram showing police activity, the covered gurney removing Valentina's body. By afternoon, the investigation had a prime suspect, and that suspect was asking for a lawyer. Roberto Salazar sat across from Agent Webb in a cramped security office converted into an interrogation room. A Mexican federal detective, Comandante Luis Herrera, joined the questioning. The ship remained docked in Cabo, its departure indefinitely delayed, while investigators processed what had become Mexico's jurisdiction for a crime committed in their territorial waters. Roberto had initially waived his right to an attorney, a decision that surprised Webb. Guilty suspects typically lawyered up immediately, but Roberto seemed almost eager to talk, as if confident he could explain everything away. "Tell me about your relationship with Valentina," Webb began, his tone conversational. Roberto shrugged. "No relationship. She was Clara's daughter. I married Clara. That is all. Did you get along? She was polite, distant. She did not like me replacing her father." Roberto's English, while accented, was better than he'd previously let on. "Sophia says she saw you arguing with Valentina the night before she disappeared." Roberto's expression didn't change. "Not arguing, talking. Valentina was drinking by the pool, too much. I told her to go to bed. She was angry, said I am not her father, cannot tell her what to do." "What time was this?" "Maybe 10:30, 11. Then I went to my cabin. Clara was already sleeping." Webb let silence hang between them. Roberto fidgeted slightly, the first crack in his composure. "The problem is, Roberto, we have security footage. Valentina wasn't drinking by the pool that night. She had dinner with family, went to the evening show, returned to her cabin by 9. Alone, sober." Roberto's jaw tightened. "Maybe different night. I confuse the days." Comandante Herrera leaned forward, speaking in rapid Spanish. Roberto responded in kind, his voice rising defensively. Webb understood enough Spanish to catch the gist. Herrera was pressing about Roberto's whereabouts during the critical hours of March 19th. The timeline was crucial. Valentina had been seen alive at 2:15 by a deck steward who'd brought her a bottle of water. By 6:30, when the family returned from Cabo, she was already dead and concealed in the trunk. That left roughly 4 hours. 4 hours when Roberto claimed to have been ashore with Clara. But Clara's statement revealed a gap. She and Roberto had separated around 3 o'clock. Clara wanted to shop for souvenirs, while Roberto preferred to find a cantina and watch soccer. They'd agreed to meet at the tender dock at 5:30. Clara had her purchases timestamped by credit card receipts. Roberto had no proof of where he'd been. "I watched the game at a bar near the marina," Roberto insisted. "Real Madrid versus Barcelona. Many people there. They will remember." Webb doubted that. A tourist in a crowded Cabo bar during high season? Anonymous and forgettable, forensic teams had processed the crime scene with meticulous care. The trunk where Valentina's body was found contained fibers, hair, and most importantly, fingerprints. Roberto's fingerprints were all over the trunk's exterior and interior surfaces. His explanation was that he'd helped Clara store luggage in it when they'd first boarded. But the position and pattern of the prints suggested more recent contact, including on the underside of the lid. More damning was the discovery in Roberto and Clara's cabin. Investigators found a shirt balled up in the back of Roberto's suitcase. The shirt showed minute traces of blood. Testing would determine if it matched Valentina's type. "That shirt, I cut myself shaving 3 days ago," Roberto said when confronted. "Wiped blood with it." "You shaved with your shirt on?" Webb asked skeptically. Roberto's face reddened. "I was getting dressed. Blood dripped. I grabbed what was close." The medical examiner's preliminary findings painted a clearer picture. Valentina had died from manual strangulation, not a chokehold but sustained pressure from hands around her throat. The killer would have needed to maintain pressure for several minutes. This was personal, intimate violence. Her attacker would have looked into her eyes as she died. Defensive wounds on Valentina's hands showed skin cells under her fingernails. DNA testing would take days, but Roberto had fresh scratches on his forearms. When asked about them, he claimed he'd scraped himself on a rough wall while drinking in Cabo. Agent Webb had investigated dozens of homicides. Experience taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct screamed that Roberto was guilty. But instinct wasn't evidence. They needed concrete proof, a confession, or a witness. What they got instead was something unexpected. Another passenger came forward with information that complicated the entire investigation. Patricia Morrison was a retired schoolteacher from Portland traveling alone, treating herself to a long-delayed vacation after her husband's death the previous year. She'd been on the same deck as the Restrepo family, though she hadn't known them personally. What she had witnessed, however, would force investigators to reconsider their assumptions. Patricia approached Agent Webb hesitantly on March 22nd, the day after Valentina's body was discovered. She debated whether to come forward, worried about getting involved, but her conscience wouldn't allow silence. "I saw something strange," she began, settling into a chair across from Webb. "On the 19th, around 4 in the afternoon." Webb's attention sharpened. 4 o'clock fell squarely within the critical window when Valentina had likely been killed. Patricia explained that she'd been returning to her cabin from the library when she'd noticed a man standing outside stateroom 8247, the cabin where Valentina's body would later be found. The man had been using a key card repeatedly, seeming frustrated that the door wouldn't open. "Can you describe him?" Webb asked. "Older gentleman, maybe 60 or so, heavy build, dark hair graying. He was wearing cargo shorts and a blue polo shirt." The description matched Roberto perfectly. Webb felt a surge of satisfaction. This placed Roberto at Valentina's cabin during the exact time frame of the murder, contradicting his claim that he'd been in Cabo. But Patricia wasn't finished. "The thing is," she continued, "I didn't think much of it at the time. Lots of people struggle with those electronic keys. But about 10 minutes later, I passed by again on my way to the pool. The door was open, and I heard voices inside, arguing, a man and a woman." "Could you make out what they were saying?" Patricia shook her head. "They were speaking Spanish, fast, angry Spanish, but I definitely heard a woman's voice, frightened, saying no repeatedly. And the man's voice was harsh, threatening." Webb leaned forward. "Did you see who was inside?" "No. The door was only partially open and I didn't want to intrude. I kept walking. But the woman's voice, it stayed with me. She sounded terrified." This was crucial testimony. It placed Roberto at the scene and established that an altercation had occurred. But Webb needed more. He needed to eliminate any reasonable doubt. Comandante Herrera joined the questioning. "Senora Morrison, you are certain about the time? 4 o'clock?" Patricia nodded firmly. "I checked my watch because I wanted to make sure I had time for a swim before dinner. It was definitely around 4. But the timeline presented a problem. Mexican federal police had verified Roberto's alibi through a breakthrough. A security camera at a marina-side restaurant in Cabo showed Roberto seated at an outdoor table from 3:20 until 5:15. The timestamp was clear, the image unmistakable. Roberto had been telling the truth about watching soccer in Cabo. Unless he'd somehow made it back to the ship, killed Valentina, and returned to Cabo, all within an impossibly tight window, Roberto couldn't have been the man Patricia saw. Webb felt his case crumbling. He brought Patricia photographs of Roberto. She studied them carefully, then looked up with uncertainty clouding her features. It looked like him, very similar, but I only saw him from the side, and I wasn't paying close attention. I suppose it could have been someone else. The defense would destroy this identification in court. A witness who thought she saw the defendant wasn't enough. Webb returned to Roberto's interrogation with new questions. If Roberto had been in Cabo, as the footage proved, then who had been at Valentina's cabin? Who had argued with her? And most critically, who had killed her? Roberto's demeanor had shifted. Learning about his verified alibi had restored his confidence. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a slight smirk playing at his lips. "I told you I was in Cabo. You did not believe me. Now you know I speak truth." "Then who killed Valentina?" Webb demanded. Roberto's smirk widened. "That is your job to discover, Agent Webb, not mine." The investigation was at an impasse. Every piece of evidence pointed to Roberto, yet he had an alibi. Unless that alibi was somehow fabricated, or unless Roberto had an accomplice. Webb's phone buzzed with a text from the forensics team. The message made his blood run cold. The DNA under Valentina's fingernails had been processed. It wasn't a match for Roberto Salazar. It belonged to someone else entirely, someone whose profile wasn't in any database. They had the wrong suspect, and the real killer was still aboard the ship. The revelation about the DNA sent investigators in a new direction. If Roberto hadn't physically killed Valentina, perhaps he'd orchestrated it. Webb had seen enough conspiracies to know that murders could be committed by proxy, especially when the primary suspect had motive and means to arrange it. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Diego, Valentina's brother, had been conducting his own investigation, unable to trust that authorities were moving fast enough. He'd spent hours reviewing his sister's text messages and social media, searching for anything that might explain her death. What he found was a series of messages Valentina had sent to a close friend in Los Angeles 2 weeks before the cruise. The messages painted a disturbing picture of life in the Restrepo household since Clara's remarriage. "Roberto gives me weird looks when Mom isn't around," one message read, "always finding excuses to be alone with me. I told Camilla, but she thinks I'm overreacting." Another message, sent just days before departure. "I don't want to go on this cruise. Being trapped on a boat with him for a week sounds like torture, but Mom would be heartbroken if I backed out." Diego brought these messages to Agent Webb, his hands shaking with rage and grief. He was harassing her. My sister was afraid of him, and none of us protected her. Webb studied the messages carefully. They established a pattern of unwanted attention, possibly sexual harassment. This provided clear motive. Roberto had desired Valentina. She'd rejected him. The cruise provided opportunity, isolation, proximity, and the false security of being surrounded by family. But the DNA evidence remained problematic. If Roberto hadn't physically strangled Valentina, who had? The answer emerged when investigators took DNA samples from every male family member for elimination purposes. The profile found under Valentina's fingernails matched Diego's teenage son, 16-year-old Mateo. The discovery seemed impossible. Mateo was a quiet kid, small for his age, devoted to his Aunt Valentina. He'd been devastated by her disappearance and inconsolable after learning of her death. The idea that he could have killed her made no sense, unless he hadn't acted alone. Webb brought Mateo in for questioning with his parents present. The boy was terrified, eyes red from crying, barely able to speak. His mother held his hand protectively, while Diego paced like a caged animal. "Mateo, we need to understand how your DNA ended up under your aunt's fingernails," Webb said gently. "I don't know," the boy whispered. "I loved Tia Valentina. I would never hurt her." "When was the last time you saw her?" Mateo's face crumpled. The day before she died, she was upset about something. I asked if she was okay. She hugged me, that's all. Just a hug. A hug could explain the DNA transfer. Valentina's hands on Mateo's shoulders, skin cells transferring naturally. But forensic experts insisted the cells under her nails suggested a struggle, scratching at an attacker. Webb shifted tactics. Did Roberto ever ask you to do anything for him? Deliver messages to Valentina? Keep secrets from your grandmother? Mateo's eyes widened. He asked me to give Tia a note, the morning she disappeared. The room went silent. Diego stopped pacing. Webb leaned forward. What did the note say? I don't know. It was sealed in an envelope. Roberto said it was an apology, that he and Tia had argued and he wanted to make peace. Did you give her the note? Mateo nodded miserably. I slid it under her cabin door around noon. She texted me later asking if I knew what Roberto wanted to meet about. Meet about? Webb's pulse quickened. The note asked her to meet him at 4 o'clock on deck 8, near the storage rooms. He said they needed to talk privately. The pieces were falling into place. Roberto had lured Valentina to an isolated location. But his alibi proved he'd been in Cabo at 4, which meant someone else had been waiting for Valentina on deck 8. Webb reviewed security footage with renewed focus. Deck 8 at 4 in the afternoon showed several passengers moving through corridors. Then, at 4:03, a figure appeared wearing a blue polo shirt and cargo shorts, the same outfit Patricia Morrison had described seeing outside Valentina's cabin. The man's face was partially obscured by a baseball cap, but his build and movement seemed familiar. Webb enhanced the image, adjusting contrast and clarity. It wasn't Roberto, it was Clara. The realization hit Webb like a physical blow. Clara had worn Roberto's clothing to impersonate him, creating the illusion that he'd been the one stalking Valentina. The build was right. Clara was a heavy-set woman, nearly as tall as her husband. From a distance, dressed in his clothes and a cap, she could easily pass for him. But why would a mother murder her own daughter? Webb ordered Clara brought in immediately. She arrived looking haggard, her grief seemingly genuine, but Webb had learned that the most dangerous killers were often the best actors. Clara, we need to talk about March 19th. Webb began, his tone harder than before. I already told you everything. I was shopping in Cabo. You were seen on the ship at 4 o'clock, on deck 8, wearing Roberto's clothes. Clara's face went pale. For a long moment she said nothing, then slowly her expression transformed. The mask of grief fell away, replaced by something cold and calculating. You can't prove that. We have footage, we have witnesses, and we have motive. What motive could I possibly have? Webb laid out the evidence systematically. Financial records showed Clara and Roberto were drowning in debt. Roberto's construction business had failed. They'd mortgaged everything, borrowed from everyone. Valentina had a life insurance policy worth $200,000, with Clara listed as beneficiary. A policy from Valentina's teaching position that she'd never updated after her father's death. More damning were text messages between Clara and Roberto, found on Clara's phone, messages she'd failed to delete completely. In them, they discussed their financial desperation. They discussed Valentina's policy, and in one chilling exchange from 2 weeks before the cruise, Roberto had written, "The ship is perfect. Accidents happen. Nobody would question it." Clara had responded, "She's my daughter." Roberto's reply, "She's our only way out." Confronted with this evidence, Clara's composure shattered. She began weeping. But these weren't tears of grief. They were tears of self-pity and rage. "You don't understand," she sobbed. "We were going to lose everything. The house, the cars, everything we'd worked for. Valentina had no husband, no children. That insurance money was just sitting there doing nothing." Webb felt disgust rise in his throat. "So you killed her for money?" Roberto said it would be quick. painless. He planned everything. I just had to get her alone. The full conspiracy unfolded. Roberto had deliberately stayed in Cabo to establish his alibi, while Clara returned to the ship early on a separate tender. She changed into Roberto's clothes, knowing security footage would implicate him if anything went wrong. She'd sent the note through Mateo, forging Roberto's handwriting, luring Valentina to the isolated meeting. When Valentina arrived, confused and wary, Clara had confronted her. An argument erupted. Valentina realized what was happening, tried to fight back. She scratched at her attacker, but Clara was stronger, fueled by desperation and greed. Clara had strangled her own daughter with her bare hands, then dragged the body to Valentina's cabin and hidden it in the trunk. The plan had been for the body to be discovered after the ship returned to San Diego, making investigation more complicated with jurisdictional issues. But the cabin attendant's discovery had accelerated everything. Comandante Herrera arrested Clara on the spot, reading her rights in Spanish while she continued sobbing. Roberto was arrested as an accessory to murder, conspiracy and fraud. Both would face trial in Mexico, where the crime had been committed. Diego watched his mother being led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of devastated betrayal. His children would grow up knowing their grandmother had murdered their beloved aunt. The family Clara claimed to be protecting had been destroyed by her greed. Agent Webb stood on the deck as the sun set over Cabo, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. In his 20 years with the FBI, he'd seen humanity's darkest impulses. But a mother killing her child for insurance money, that would haunt him. Valentina Restrepo had been 34 years old, a teacher who loved her students, a sister who supported her family, a woman whose only crime was being worth more dead than alive to people who should have loved her most. The monarch of the seas finally departed Cabo 3 days later, carrying passengers eager to forget the horror that had unfolded. But for those who knew Valentina, the wound would never fully heal. Justice would be served. Clara and Roberto would spend decades in Mexican prison, but no sentence could restore what had been taken. No punishment could resurrect the dead. Valentina's body was returned to Los Angeles, where hundreds attended her funeral. Her students created a memorial garden at the school. Her siblings established a scholarship in her name. And somewhere in the Pacific, where the sun meets the sea, her memory lived on.